wouldn't you say that the entrepreneurial spirit is driven by the desire to go upwards from where you are?
What do you mean by upwards?
I guess upwards is a huge metaphor, so huge and like well ingrained that, yeah, I didn't even notice that's a metaphor. So you start life from zero essentially. So
What is
more,
zero?
better.
What is zero?
Zero, you have earned nothing, and all you have is that which is given to you by your parents, which isn't a lot.
Well, yeah, I would say you have your body by default. When you're a baby, it's not a very useful body. It really can't do very much except cry, wiggle around,
And
think
figure out
most.
how to use itself so it becomes more useful.
Yeah, so
That's the main thing
that's
it
as
does.
close to zero as you can get. If we're
Yeah.
what we're trying to quantify is the ability to willfully interact with reality in a useful or subjectively preferable way. Your subjective preference, of course, right?
Mine for everyone, right?
No,
Not
no, no.
theirs for themselves.
Every individual person. No,
Nuts.
no. Sorry. Now you're
Cool.
sounding like a dictator. So that's what a dictator is.
Yes.
One who assigns his subjective preference over other people's. Right. So that's pretty close to zero because you can do almost nothing as a baby. And I would even argue you probably don't really have any meaningful amount of will or volition, although that's really hard to measure objectively, isn't it?
And you
Uh,
can't like survey babies, ask them
Right.
questions because
Right.
they can't answer.
We have to make informed guesses based on our own memories of having been young children, although I don't think anybody remembers being a baby. If they did, that might strongly imply that babies have at least some small amount of will and consciousness if you could remember being a baby. Some people claim they
Earliest back
can.
I remember is two and a bit.
Yeah, I think maybe 3 is common for most people as the earliest memories.
Oh, I guess I'm
Um,
better.
I guess so. That's proof. You developed consciousness before any of us. Some people do claim that they can remember being babies and even being born, but those people are probably full of shit.
Liars.
Yeah, or just heavily deluded, so we'll ignore those people. So
Stephen Fry makes a joke about it. I'm assuming a joke, like, because yeah, he looked back up and said, "I'm never going back and run those again."
uh-huh. Start from 0. 0 being not necessarily 0 material possessions, but rather 0 willful ability to interact with reality to get what you want from it. Yes, we all start from that. And then we develop the ability to willfully interact with reality to get what we want from it as we get older, physically more capable, dexterous, stronger, and more importantly, smarter. We acquire knowledge, ideas about how reality works that we use to our advantage.
Starting with what tiny little will we have, and by just absorbing information about reality and putting it together.
Yeah, and that's really where we get most of our scalability from because if you think about it, the strongest person who's ever lived, I don't know, one of those, like, I think the guy who played the Mountain in Game of Thrones is one of the strongest people who's ever lived. Like, he broke some records for deadlifting or something. I don't know. Um,
Blimey,
right. Can he actually use that physical
broke
strength?
some eyeballs in that series.
Yes, he did.
Oh.
He squeezed the Mandalorian's head. Poor guy. Should have
Yeah,
been wearing a helmet.
he squeezed Joel's
Joel.
head, yeah.
Yeah, Joel. Right. So there's a
He
really
lost half.
fucking strong guy, right? But can he really do a lot of useful things with that strength besides competing in weightlifting competitions and intimidating other men?
If he's in the right place at the right time, then yeah, but that's easier said than done. Like if he just can be whisked to emergencies within like a few minutes, then yes, he would be extremely useful. If there were like 100 of him around the world, just kind of in the best spots, like a few minutes away by some super fast means of travel, just get one of the big lifters to the massive emergency that requires
Okay.
lifting.
Or you could just do that with any tool that replicates the same effect, right? Okay, so I'm trying to make a point here. The point is,
Go ahead.
while it's a great idea for any of us to get in shape and get physically stronger or flexible or faster or whatever, like I would love it if I were twice as strong as I am now. Like that'd be really fucking strong, you know? Like I still wouldn't be nearly as strong as the mountain, I'm sure, but like imagine how many more things I could do if I were twice as strong. I could jump over
Mm.
fences easily. I could, you know, lift furniture and move it around my house more easily with requiring fewer
Hunt better,
friends to help me. I mean,
fire arrows further,
sure,
and
if I cared about that. That's not
yeah,
something I currently care about, but potentially sure. And so then you compare that to like our ancestors, our hunter warrior ancestors, who are probably much more physically adept than most of us today, right?
yeah,
Yet
we
we,
slacken.
so even if we got as physically strong and dexterous and skilled as them, none of that, very little of that, I should say, is what accounts for our present ability to have mastered our willful interactions with reality. The modern man and woman in a developed nation has more volitional control over reality to get what they want from it than almost anyone who's ever existed in history. And it's not because they are physically stronger or more adept.
I think the adeptness has something in that. Obviously, mental is a huge part of it, but that is part of like being able to do exactly what you want with your hands to get
Yeah, well,
like
yeah,
to do exactly what you want
compared
with
to the
tools,
rest of the animal
machines.
kingdom, yes, the way we use our hands is like a miracle in nature. No other animal comes close. Apes, you know, because they're our closest living relatives, can do a lot of interesting shit too. But compared to animals and plants at large, yeah, of course, just having fingers that we can use so precisely is kind of a miracle of biology. But I'm talking about, you know, the history of human development. If we take that as a given, the most basic ability to interact with reality physically with our digits, right? Um, the reason we are so affluent, that we're so far beyond zero, that the average adults today in a developed part of the world, is because we have accumulated useful ideas about how reality works. That's the scalability I'm talking about. That's how you go as far beyond zero as you can get in a human lifetime.
So I guess one of us should say that we're looking to talk about your book. Do you have a copy at hand? As you can see on Gregory's wall, he has artwork to match.
Yes, actually, you can see this one on the back of the book, and
That's exactly the same.
the other two are in the book too. I chose these because these are old Soviet propaganda posters, essentially talking about the importance of learning in order to produce more wealth in life. This one, translated from Russian, says, "In order to build, one must know. In order to know, one must
One
learn."
must think. Ah,
Mm.
I was gonna go think. I
And
didn't think last time.
there's one at the end too, the one with all the books. Knowledge will break the chains of slavery. Right? So there's heavy emphasis
Whereas
on,
communism will put more on them.
that's the irony, which we'll get to. The book is called Everyone is an Entrepreneur: Selling Economic Self-Determination in a Post-Soviet World. It's about my experiences primarily living here in Armenia the last 5 years, but also some other traveling to different parts of the world I've been to that gave me an interesting perspective on societal development and economics. And a major theme of the book, actually, I'll read you the dedication because it's exactly what we're talking about. Knowledge is the prime source of wealth in the world. The knowledge promoted by this book represents my best attempt to temper the problem of inadequate wealth to sustain human comfort and thriving, otherwise known as poverty. It is how I wish to contribute to a state of ample opportunities among all people, which we can think of as greater wealth. Consequently, this book is dedicated to humanity. Yeah, we acquire useful knowledge, which we turn into various tools through our skills. You know, like a skill is kind of like knowledge applied, kind of like how physics is math applied. You know what I mean? Or logic applied.
Skill is knowledge applied, tools are skill applied. And then you further apply your skill to the tools to make capital, I guess.
Um,
Capital is tools and
yeah,
skill applied.
so it's if you think about the difference between a capital good and a consumption good is that one is about immediate satisfaction and one is about delayed satisfaction. A capital good is anything you use to produce satisfaction later, basically. Any tool, right, that isn't being used to immediately bring you happiness or fulfillment of some kind. Anything you consume is about that. Like, I'm hungry, I need some food, I'm going to eat it. Oh, good, I'm not hungry anymore. It has brought me satisfaction, whereas I don't know of anyone who buys a hammer just because they love hammers. I mean, I suppose you could in principle. Like,
There
I'm
would be
sure there are
those.
hammer collectors who
Yeah,
just love hammers, right? But the vast
they
majority,
use some of them, and then they're like,
right?
"This, love this."
The vast majority of people who own a hammer are using it to do something else that will eventually bring them satisfaction. And it could be heavily delayed satisfaction. It could take months or years to eventually allow them to reap the reward of that satisfaction. It's an investment, essentially.
Are there hammers in the Bible? Do you know? Just occurred to me. I was thinking Jesus building stuff
They
or something
nailed
like that
him
when you
to a
said that.
cross. What do you think they drove the nails with?
Would it have been a hammer or some cruder implement that we couldn't really
Some
call a
kind of
hammer?
mallet? I don't know. I mean, what is a hammer in principle? It's a heavy thing on the end of a stick, a weighted lever, basically. I'm sure it's one of our oldest tools as a species.
What if they just had the stick part and that sufficed for their primitive
I don't
purposes?
think we would classify that as a hammer. I think the weighted end is an essential part of what makes it a hammer. Just be like a staff of some kind then. I don't know.
So some of our tools go way back thousands of years then.
Yeah. I mean, the most simple mechanical machines are most of our hand tools are just applications of force in the simplest possible way, right? They get nicer and shinier and slightly more refined and specific. Like a really nice modern hammer will outperform an ancient hammer in every way, I'm sure, but it's still the same principle.
Some of the some advancements that humanity has made have been much more powerful in terms of what they help us as humans to do than others. But of course, not everyone's going to be able to do those. So within one's own life, one has to use a lot of the massive advancements and contribute in one's own way. Does that make some people more of an entrepreneur, the ones who produce much larger, grander advancements than those working with those to produce smaller advancements within their capabilities?
I wouldn't qualify or quantify entrepreneurship quite like that. That's a huge fallacy, actually, that I do talk about in the book, which is basically the no true Scotsman fallacy. Well, no true entrepreneur, you know. Um, like the standards and limits are quite arbitrary. It's like, well, you're not a real entrepreneur until you're making at least 7 figures of revenue every year. You're not a real entrepreneur unless you have at least 20 people and a full-time staff. You're not a real entrepreneur until you sell at least 3 million units per year or something, right?
You're
It's
not a
all
real entrepreneur if you use anything produced by anyone else that you can't make. And so we go back to you're not an entrepreneur
right,
if you use the universe.
right. Um, there
If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch.
you must, if you wish to be an entrepreneur, you must first invent the universe. Um, so that we're getting into a lot of topics that I go into detail in the book, which is yeah, essentially gatekeeping entrepreneurship, even by people who mean well, but it's kind of vain of them to say like, well, I'm a real entrepreneur. I earned my way to the top, right? Well, if you're using someone else's product, you're not a real entrepreneur. Or if you're being paid a salary, you're not a real entrepreneur, right? Um, I will often use the example of, well, I consider myself an education entrepreneur because I produce knowledge products such as books and now such as this video. This is a knowledge product in a different form. However, it might or might not be monetized. It is a product that communicates knowledge that some people may find subjectively valuable and choose to consume, right? And so I'll give the example. Am I not a true entrepreneur because I don't run a book printing press to produce my books? Like, would that make me a real entrepreneur then if I ran that that company, right?
I
Or is there
wasn't even fully sure you didn't because you have your own publishing company.
right? So what does that mean, right? I run a what I've been calling a boutique assisted self-publishing company called Identity Publications, right? Does that mean that I have to own a building with a printing press that prints thousands of books per day? Would that make me a real publisher, right? Or do I use various knowledge, skills, and other tools to help people produce books? First, the idea of a book, the principle of a book, get it written, and then send that information to other people who already own printing presses and probably operate them much more efficiently than I ever could. Does that mean, like,
I'm gonna
where
go
do you,
that latter. Is that right?
if you use the postal service in your business, does that make you not a real entrepreneur? Should you have to run your own delivery service for all your products to be a real entrepreneur? Do you see what I mean? Like, where
Fuse
is the limit?
cars.
Yeah, did you build that car yourself, right? How dare you? You know,
Elizabeth Warren, you didn't build that.
right.
You're not a real entrepreneur.
So you can see how absurd this starts to get anytime you start to put any kind of practical limit on like what you can or can't do to be considered a real entrepreneur. So really the principle at any scale of operation is just that you're willfully contributing some kind of unique value to the economy. And the more you can interact with other people who are also contributing some kind of unique value to the economy to increase, synergize, the total valuable output of what both of you offer, the more gets produced. People, the companies that run just become like tools then. If you have better tools, you can apply your knowledge and your skills more effectively with greater leverage to produce more.
And the whole becomes way more than the separate sum of its individual parts.
Yes, it's called the division of labor and synergy, right? An economy is as efficient as it can divide its labor into the people best suited to do various tasks with measurable output, right? I don't run a
So,
printing press because I'm not the most qualified person to do that.
what does labor mean exactly in the context of division of labor in your idea of it?
An investment of work, energy, and skills to produce something valuable.
So, it's not just physical labor, then, is it?
No, why would it just be physical? Again, now we're going back to the mountain. If the value of labor came directly from like some kind of objective measure of physical strength, then the mountain would be the most valuable person who ever existed because he could lift the heaviest boulders, right? That's a very, very oversimplified economic calculation, right? Because value is actually subjective, right? It's what people want. And what people want is constantly changing and depends on where you go in the world and who the people are. And the best ways to produce those things are constantly changing too, because we're always coming up with new technology, new tools, new ideas, new science, new understanding of how things work, which is why we don't use the same production methods we did 100 years ago. Or, God, even before the Industrial Revolution.
What do you most want people to get from this book from having read it?
Okay, so the book is, in many ways, it's like an economic primer, but it's also kind of a human interest story and a travel and a culture story. Because I'm trying to explain economic lessons that most people, even if they're kind of familiar with, aware of, they don't really see how it applies on an absolute scale to all human endeavors, all human choices. And I'm using the framing of my experience living in Armenia, a post-Soviet country, these last several years, to show how it's like this extreme end of people who never really learned to think for themselves, or even the ones who can think for themselves and are smart and talented in a lot of ways, lack the emotional confidence to make most of their own choices. And that's the origin of entrepreneurial action. The ability to make choices and willingly take on risk in the pursuit of producing something you consider valuable. And we really take that for granted in the West. You're in the UK, I'm from America, California, and I can certainly tell you that of all the places I've been to, America by far still has the strongest natural cultural entrepreneurial spirit, where even people who have no formal education in business, who don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs, just have this natural inclination toward finding interesting ways to solve problems, make money in unconventional ways by offering people something they want. It's just part of the culture. It's heavily encouraged. And
Well, America was made essentially by people like that. And then those values of character have been passed down over the last, what, 2.5 centuries, right?
right, there's a very strong argument you could make that the origins of America from the American Revolution, the kind of people who immigrated to America, who took great risk to be pioneers, to settle and develop a new way of life, there was kind of a natural selection filter for a certain type of personality, a trait. I think you could easily make that inference, right? It'd be very interesting to study. Someone more qualified than me could really look into that. But however it happened, even today, almost 300 years later, 250 years later, um, there is still, and I have a lot of problems with America, so I'm not at all trying to say like America is the greatest country in the world, you know. But in this regard, in terms of the freedom to think and make choices and take responsibility for your own life, I don't know any other country that does it as well as modern America still. And
No. Even
particularly,
modern America with its like more problems, more subcultures, essentially infiltrating and undermining it, all with all of its problems, I don't think there is another.
yeah. And you can certainly share your experiences in the UK if you think that would be interesting.
Yeah, people in the UK don't really believe in freedom, to sum up everything I've learned being here. They don't feel it in their bones. They don't want it. They don't yearn to be self-determined human beings for the most part. They need a father overarching their entire lives to keep them secure in his bosom, perhaps mixing metaphors. A father and a mother. The
Sure.
state is the father and the mother,
Yes.
paternally and maternally protecting the person from birth till death, safe from the worst possible consequences that reality can offer if they were to interact with it without an intermediate.
It's interesting you brought,
That's the UK.
yeah, it's interesting you brought up the father and mother comparison because I think there's some correlation where fascist governments take on the father archetype and communist governments take on the mother archetype. I had a lot more thoughts on
We're
this at
going
one
towards
point.
both, I think.
Yeah, I'd have to re-explore exactly why that is. But here in post-Soviet Armenia, it's been more than 30 years now. 1991 is when the Soviet Union collapsed. And in many ways, people still live like they're waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Like they even if you can show them so much obviously better ways of doing things, it's like that part of their brain has atrophied and they have
Or never
heavily,
developed.
yeah, and they've heavily
Don't know
pressured.
which is more terrifying.
Yeah, like they were lobotomized basically before their brain even developed in some cases. And the culture encourages their children and grandchildren to act the same way because obviously anyone under 30 never directly experienced the Soviet Union, but many of them still hold on to those same fears and insecurities. I know teenagers who think the way their parents really heavily force them to. The dominant emotion in Armenia is shame or fear or guilt, but primarily like what will people think if I act differently, if I think for myself, if I make my
Shame.
own choices,
Shame.
right?
Game of Thrones.
And that's an important distinction to make because otherwise, to an outside observer, it might just look like they're all a bunch of fucking idiots, which sometimes
You
I'm
have
tempted to
detailed
think
a lot
that.
of stuff that makes it sound
Well, some of
like
them
that.
are definitely. Every country has fucking idiots, right? Um, but because otherwise
They seem to have like massive swathes of concepts we take for granted just missing from their minds, like a
yes.
lot of people
I
from
swear to God, some of
your
the shit
tales.
like that I have written down, like I could not have imagined, and I've so much of it I've gotten used to now. But when I tell other people about this stuff or they read the stuff I've written, they don't believe me sometimes. Sometimes our
Like the whole
character,
privacy stuff, it's just
yes,
not seemingly a concept in their minds, privacy. And
right,
maybe that's
as
from lacking
particularly
individualism in some sense.
yes, in lesser developed parts of the country and more rural parts of the country, it's like they don't fully grasp the concept of private property, both in terms of like your house and your actual personal privacy and like the stuff you own. It's more like a suggestion. It's like, yeah, they know it's yours, but it doesn't really matter that it's yours. It's like it's everyone's. So if we need it, we'll go use it. I've had for the first 3 years, it was the worst here. And then I eventually figured out the only effective solution was to start publicly shaming them. Because remember, Armenians are hypersensitive to shame, right?
Like, do
Yeah.
you
So,
think that might have adverse
oh, of course it is.
effects in terms of what you want to do in
I'm
Armenia,
quite a
like
controversial
relying
figure
on
here now.
shame?
Yes. I'm both famous
I
and in the
mean,
news
deeper
here.
than that, like um reinforcing shame being the motivator as opposed to
Well, it was a
what you want
last
people
resort
to be
for me.
motivated by.
I didn't like I only did it because I didn't know what else to do. Because you can sit and explain things to people, intelligent adults, capable adults who, with skilled crafts and so forth. And you can tell them, I don't mind if you want to borrow my tools. I just need you to ask me before you do so that I don't wake up one day and my
And knock
chainsaw,
before entering,
yeah, and my drill are gone and I don't know where they are and I don't know who used them last and why they're suddenly not working, right? Or yeah, when
or
you come
wake
to
up
my
one day and
house,
you're over my bed trying to
yeah,
like just
again,
come in and maybe you're
all of
trying to look
this
for something.
sounds like an exaggeration to the Americans who read the book. But I swear to God, this is real, and it's been my daily experience for years until I finally found methods that are somewhat effective against it. They don't know how to ask permission before entering someone else's property. If doors are closed, they just open them. They come inside and just start taking whatever they want or screaming your name. If doors are locked, they get confused and frustrated. Like, wait, why isn't this door opening? Well, because you don't live here. That's why. Like, this is
Did
my
you ever
house.
try locking and find that out firsthand?
Yes, it was too
Because
much
you
of
were
a
quite
hassle
adamant
to.
about I shouldn't need a lock.
Right. So part of it in principle, I shouldn't have to lock my own fucking house while I'm home if I don't want to. You should learn not to come in my house, right? But also it really is just kind of a hassle. It becomes a stressful thing. You have to always constantly remember, shit, did I lock my door? What if someone comes in, you know?
Here it's kind of you take it for granted. You lock your door.
Because of crime,
I guess,
yeah,
yeah, is the main thing.
maybe.
Yeah,
And
crime
that's the
ain't
thing.
great.
There's not a lot of crime here. I don't think any of my neighbors would maliciously steal shit from me.
Yeah,
Right.
they're still committing crimes, just
Right.
not
That's what's
intending
so
to.
weird about it. It's they're innocently committing these crimes, and no matter how many times you explain it to them, like I value my privacy, I don't like being interrupted. I like to know when people are in my house. I like to know where my shit is, the shit I spent thousands of dollars on. They nod like they get it. Yeah, of course, that's your culture. Like they get it that in other parts of the world that's how people do things, but they cannot change their actions for more than like a day. Like they always just revert back to that default state of I'm just going to do whatever I want. That's the way it works.
Have you tried shouting at them, stop innocently committing crimes?
I don't know the exact translation for that in Armenian, so no. But I put
Uh,
signs all over my fucking doors saying like, knock or ring the bell before you come in, please. Seriously, like, and it just it's so hard for them to change that conditioning. And so you can see how even with such a simple thing like this, like something where they understand the logic behind it. Okay, Gregory doesn't like it when people interrupt him. Gregory doesn't like it when people take his shit without asking, right? But they still
really sounds
cannot
like
change
there's
their behavior.
something missing in their brains. No offense, Gregory's neighbors, but come on.
And again, I really don't think it's strictly an intelligence thing because some of them are quite capable as people, right? They're not just like
Well, what
idiots
is
with 60
intelligence then
IQ
if
running around.
it's what is intelligence if it's not the capacity to deal appropriately with reality and
Well,
integrate new material?
yeah, and intelligence is the ability to categorize information. The problem is taking that information and transforming it into new actions, which is emotional. Your emotions guide your actions too, not just your knowledge of how things work or should work. What's the point I'm trying to make with this? That you see how these things start to apply throughout the society, even like in the cities where this particular problem doesn't apply. Like people aren't walking into each other's apartments in the city. It's a bit more civilized there, right? Because social pressures kind of force people to act a different way. It's still unconscious. If you've been conditioned for generations into thinking that you can't make your own choices, you can't devise a better way to do things, you can't see things that your parents wouldn't see and decide, oh, I don't have to live exactly the same way they did because I can figure out ways to produce things on my own and make money on my own. Any basically talented and intelligent young person could figure
Are
out
there any
more money than their
famous
parents.
in Armenia? I guess there are actors, but are there any other famous like Armenians known for any kind of like artistic um endeavors? Like I'm sure there's got to be actors because there's actors everywhere, but like I don't know, artists, musicians, stuff like that.
Well, there's Kim Kardashian. She's the first person people associate with Armenia. She produced
But
some
associate
sex
with,
tape. I
she's
don't know if
not
you consider that
stayed in
art.
Armenia, has she? She's kind
No,
of spread
I'm
her
sure she's
wings
visited the
away.
country many times, but no, she lives in the U.S.
Any that still live in Armenia?
Not internationally known. I don't think so. Cher is Armenian, the singer Cher.
But she's another who
Yeah,
didn't
again,
stay in
she
Armenia,
she
did
found her
she?
success in America, right? No, Armenia doesn't really exist on the world's radar to a large
What
extent.
about within Armenia then, like famous artistic people,
Yeah,
celebrities,
yeah, no, yeah, there are
celebrity
local
artistry?
celebrities, local artists, local authors and creators. I don't know a
As
lot,
in,
but
when you say local, do you mean local, or do you mean Armenia, like
well,
well
Armenia,
known
yeah,
within all of
well
Armenia?
known within Armenia, but that's Armenia is not a very big country and has a population of about 3 million.
Blimey.
Yeah, so like that's when I said
That's, I
I'm
think, a lot. I think that's quite a bit less than just London.
yeah, probably. When I said I'm kind of a controversial figure here who's kind of both famous and infamous, depending on who you ask, that wasn't too much of an exaggeration. I'm kind of well known around the country just because I'm an American of partial Armenian descent. My grandmother was Armenian who moved back to the country. Like, okay, that's interesting. A repat. Oh, he moved to a village. Oh, he's an author. Oh, he's writing books about Armenia now. Oh, he has some really controversial opinions about Armenian
Let's send him
customs and
death
culture.
threats.
Yeah, right. So people either love me or hate me here has been my experience. Some of the more progressively minded one really love that I'm talking about these things and
Gregory
shaming
Marmite
things
Diehl.
that should be shamed. And yeah, be well beyond the economic sphere, the cultural sphere too, about some very, very outdated primitive cultural practices they have regarding family and relationships and shame, again, shame everywhere in this country. But when I talk about the economic side of things too, from a very objective standpoint, about this is just how economics works. Like it's not because I want it to. It's not because I prefer capitalism over communism. It's how it works, right? Like in an absolute
Yeah,
basis.
capitalism versus communism isn't an example of a subjective value. It's communism is destructive of human life from the root. Capitalism is not.
Right. So, and I use the objective measure, the absolute standard I'm applying in the book is economic equilibrium, which is where the most people are getting as much as possible for the least possible costs in an economy, right? The equilibrium of supply and demand on a large scale. So the argument is, do you get that better by having a dictator in control of the economy telling everyone what to do? Or do you get that better by letting people make their own choices and be in charge of the risks they take and what they produce and be free to willfully pursue their own values, their own acquisition of material wealth or psychological wealth? Again, wealth is anything that just you value, right? It's not just money. Money is just a medium of exchange between things that you consider valuable, right? Just like thinking that wealth means money, right? When forgetting that no, it means the things money can do, the things money helps you with, exchanging the productive acts, the result of people's knowledge, skills, and tools applied in
So
managing
money
that
is
world.
basically wealth, the credit of wealth, right? It's like, hey, I've got wealth. Here's my
Yeah,
money to prove it,
right.
essentially. And then you give it to someone, and then they can do with them. They can do the same with the money. Hey, I've got wealth. Here's the money to prove it, and so
Yeah.
on.
I strongly
Like
believe
how before money, people use like what bread, wheat, stuff like that.
any kind of universally desirable commodity has served as money because the idea is that you can be relatively certain that someone somewhere will want it, even if you don't personally have any use for it right now. So you can exchange it for other things that you do want right now, right?
Stuff that
Spices,
avoids
salt,
relying on the coincidence of wants,
the
where
devil
the two
coincidence.
people happen to want the thing that the other is offering. It's
Right,
like, oh, here's an intermediate thing that's more fixed that
right.
you might not need yourself now, but you can shove along to the next person for the thing you do need, and so
Yes.
on.
Yes, exactly. It's our imperfect attempt to objectify subjective wants, basically. Like to come up with something that everyone will always want, right? Which is impossible, of course, because we all have different wants and they all get fulfilled in different ways. Like, even though, we all need water, every human being in the world, without exception, relies on water. Um, Once you've had enough to drink, do you need water as much as you did before? Once you have a swimming pool full of water, once you have reliable indoor plumbing, are you spending your days trying to get more and more water because we need water to survive? No, you already have enough. You're concerned about other things now.
Yeah, once you've stored all that water, then you want to get started on food.
And then after that, and then after that, and after that, eventually, like, it's like
After
Maslow's
that,
pyramid, right?
oxygen, right?
Well, oxygen would come even before water, but because oxygen is a free good in almost every case, right? It's not something you have to labor for. It's already there. You don't
Have you
have to
read
put.
The Moon is a Harsh Mistress?
No.
Oxygen is not part of the atmosphere, and so
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
kind of
Or
a
I
bit more
even give the
interesting.
example in the book, if you go mountain climbing, bring some oxygen with you because the free good is not available in sufficient quantities to sustain human comfort up there on the top of Mount Everest, right? So there's an exception to that. But under almost all conditions under which human beings have developed civilizations, oxygen, which we all depend on every few minutes to take a breath at the very least, is freely available. You do not have to labor, you do not have to strategize and plan and save and store it like you do with food and water and every other good that you rely on.
Yeah, I try and limit my breaths to once every few minutes too.
Good. Conserve some for future generations.
Conserve for future generations. That's an interesting remark. Do you speak at all in the book about conservationist efforts getting in the way of economic self-determination?
I don't think I specifically address that, though I do address the mentality behind that. This idea that there is a fixed amount of resources available, a fixed amount of wealth available, and that can't ever grow. So every time you consume something, you are damning everyone else to some degree, future generations
The
or other
fixed
people who
pie
don't have enough.
fallacy.
Yeah, that's yeah. And even Thanos was a victim of this fallacy when he thought that the solution to poverty throughout the universe was to kill half the people by snapping his fingers with the Infinity Stones, right? Um, because it's I mean that's just obviously wrong.
I haven't watched those films, but he sounds like a dick
He is kind of a dick.
and kind of looks like one.
Um, if your dick is purple and wrinkly, I suppose, then yes. Is it?
Well, not mine, but you know.
Ah, okay. Right, like the very if you're talking about pre-industrial societies, then I can see your point. The idea is that people will procreate faster than they produce the things they need to live a comfortable life. Wealth in various forms. Food, water, clothing, shelter, right? Without even getting into like modern technology and super nice cars and televisions and so forth. That people in pre-industrial societies tend to have more babies than they can adequately take care of, whether that's due to like ignorance that they don't know how not to have babies, or birth control doesn't exist, or just they just want to have a lot of fucking babies. I don't know, right? The
I
point is,
wonder how much that is also realizing, oh, some of those just going to die before they're 5.
yeah,
Way more
that's
common in
even
pre-industrial
even the
societies.
Armenians still have that mentality to some degree. Not because they like live in a jungle where they're afraid of like tigers snatching off their babies or something, but because they're under
Pop
constant
out
attack by
twice
their
as many
neighbors.
as you pop out twice as many as you're
Yeah,
gonna raise
figure
because
half of them will
you
die.
expect half of them will be killed.
So yeah, you got to have some margin of error in your procreation strategy, right?
Blimey.
And then of course, if they don't die, then you just have twice as many adults running around. And the problem is that most of those adults never learn how to think entrepreneurially, which would involve applying leverage through their choices to produce more than they consume through knowledge and tools to produce greater and greater amounts of stuff with less and less effort. So eventually you get exponential scalability. That isn't true with babies, because you can only have so many babies, right? A healthy woman only has so many eggs, right? But the
For now,
scalability,
until we can get, more produced with technology.
yeah, maybe at present time it still takes 9 months to make a baby, right?
I mean, like, there's a fixed number of ova in a woman from
Yeah,
birth for now, until we get technology to be able to
yeah. And if you could
make
speed up the
more
gestation
produced.
process, if you could gestate
That too,
a
yeah.
baby in a week instead of 9 months, I don't know.
Oh, I'm not sure how much that could get a bit faster, but I don't see that getting that much faster because humans are so damn complicated.
Yeah, but we're nowhere near there. But
Complex.
even if theoretically it's possible someday through our biological technology. The point that the conservationist type people are missing is that if you improve
People.
knowledge, if you improve knowledge, skills, and tools, you can increase the rate at which you produce the stuff that prevents poverty. If you make tools and knowledge faster than you make babies, you don't have poverty anymore. It's a very basic concept. Thanos never thought of that. Thanos had all the power in the universe through the Infinity Stones, and his solution was so goddamn stupid. It was, well, what if we just kill half the people? That'll solve the problem, right? Like, did you put more than 5 minutes of
For
thought into
now,
that?
until there are a load more and
Yeah,
he needs
first
to
of
do
all,
it
yeah,
again.
even ignoring like the morality of that only solves the problem for one generation. Yeah, they're just the exact same conditions that caused that still exist, right? Like people are still going to keep procreating at the same rate, right? You've just delayed it one generation. So why not use all that godly power to like create more factories and tools? And I don't know, if you have the level of technology that they have in the Marvel universe, which is essentially like Star Trek level technology, why not make like food replicators and
I
that kind
wonder
of
if
stuff?
the instinct in more what was the word you used? Pre-industrial, like more primitive societies. I wonder if the instinct to reproduce more is because who knows, one of those kids could turn out to be some kind of genius who uplifts everyone. So you keep spawning them, and then a small
Yeah,
handful lift everyone up
there's some of that
if
applied
they
here,
make it to adulthood.
and in many countries, not just here in Armenia, where it's applied in a much cruder way, which is like hoping that at least one of your children gets a good paying job when he grows up, and then he'll support you and the rest of the family in his old age.
Right.
Right? You're playing roulette. You're hoping that one of them develops the skill set and makes the right connections in life, that he gets a decent job, and then he'll support you for the rest of your life. It's
Sounds a bit
crazy.
like Russian roulette, but
It's Armenian roulette. It's poverty roulette. Instead of just like saying,
like
well, what if I put like a small amount of that energy and planning into like increasing my own knowledge and my own skills and my own technology tools to produce wealth, and I could make more money myself. by producing more and more valuable stuff that people were willing to pay me for, that I wouldn't have to rely on chance and hoping that one of my spawnlings just happens to be in a position to make a bit more money than the others. Or that they might marry rich. Like, of course, if you have a daughter here, her job is to marry a wealthy man. If you have a son, his is to be the wealthy man, right?
So this book, so we've talked quite a lot about a few aspects of it. Um, how would you summarize it in terms of sections? What are the themes in each section that you go into?
Well, it's a dense book, as all my books tend to be. Because at this point, I pretty much only write books that I think are going to completely change the way someone thinks about something. If it's not a paradigm shifter, there's no reason for you to read it. That's the same standard I apply to the books I read now. Like, I start reading a book and I have to immediately get a sense this is going to change everything I think I know about this subject. Fucking bring it on. Let's go. This is I like to write books that you actually really have to fucking pay attention to and that they're ordered in a certain way for a reason. I'm building an architecture.
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, what? Yeah. I'm trying to build a structure of knowledge from the most basic premises possible, which is why I begin this book with a section called What Wealth Is and Where It Comes From. If we don't agree on exactly what the fuck we're talking about, like if you think wealth is just making more money, then you're not going to understand anything else I have to say in this book. So that's why I start by saying things like useful knowledge is the origin of all wealth, which turns into things like skills and then technology for producing more and more stuff.
And then at least people who still disagree, this is what wealth is, can still read knowing that, well, at least I know what he's talking about, even if I disagree that it
Yes.
corresponds to what I know of as
Right.
wealth.
That's
I
the
know he's talking
Socratic
about
method,
this
right?
thing.
Socrates always said, define your terms when you start any kind of discussion or argument, so then at least everyone knows what the fuck you're talking about.
I thought the Socratic method was ask endless questions until you get to the root of
That's part of it.
what someone believes.
Yes, that tends to be how I teach things too, just asking lots of really annoying questions. My book is full of really annoying questions. So after what wealth is and where it comes from, we have how entrepreneurial thinking leads to wealth accumulation. So again, if you don't know what wealth is, as I'm using the term, then you won't understand how learning to think like an entrepreneur pretty much inevitably leads to you acquiring more and more wealth compared to people who don't think like entrepreneurs. Section 3, Anti-Entrepreneurial Biases, Misinformation and Obstacles. So this one applies particularly here in Armenia, where I'm talking about the cultural effects of like that shame and that fear and of the bucketed crab mentality.
Shame.
You know, the anecdote about the crabs trying to climb out of the bucket. I don't think it's actually based on real science, but
Is that about that they pull the others down or
yes,
something?
if the crabs near the top of the bucket try to climb out, the other crabs underneath them will pull them back down. So entrepreneurship is about change, right? It's about introducing some new kind of wealth that didn't exist before, right? So by necessity, it means not just doing the same thing everyone else around you does, which turns into things that are more commonly known like, unique sales propositions and marketing. Why should I buy your widget versus someone else's, right? That's just the downstream manifestation of realizing the importance of doing something differently, uniquely, right? And if you're in a society where people shame you for trying to be different in any way whatsoever, it's very, very difficult to adopt an entrepreneurial paradigm. But
how many countries you been to?
56.
Blimey, one of them isn't Japan.
There are 196 countries in the world, so that's only about a quarter of them, which is a very humbling thing to think about. With all the traveling I did, I've still only been to about a quarter of the countries in the world. I don't know. I don't know enough about Japan to
I think
make
that's exactly 1/3.5, 2 cents of the countries. Then, if it's 196, I might have seen different numbers, like off by a few. I've seen 193 recently, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is some debate about exactly what qualifies as a country. So, yeah, but less than 200.
Like, is Taiwan a country? Ask John
Right.
Cena.
Right. God, I forgot about that. Right. Just recently,
I'm so sorry, China.
the disputed territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan, called Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh, was recently taken over completely by Azerbaijan, but they were trying to get acknowledged as their own country.
So there's one right on your doorstep, not literally, that's literally a contested. Is this another country or is this part of
Mhm.
Azerbaijan?
Yeah, and what makes it a country is simply that enough other countries acknowledge it as a country, basically.
So the sections of your book, was that the last?
No, then there's the natural laws and qualities of entrepreneurial interaction, where I'm talking about very basic economic concepts that everyone thinks they understand, but few people actually do, such as supply and demand, which is the conflict between what is and what's wanted. Supply and demand, the conflict between what is and what's wanted, which applies to every choice you ever make. Demand is what you think you want. Supply is your perception of your options for acquiring what you think you want. That's the foundation of all economics. Every choice you
That's
ever make.
not how supply and demand is usually taken, is it? Supply is usually taken as how much supply there is, and demand is usually taken as how much demand there is for the same thing that's being
I think those
supplied,
are
right?
circular definitions you've just given. Supply is how much supply there is. Demand is how much demand there is. Whoa, no way.
No, so supply is how much of the thing, how much is
Uh-huh.
supplied, and demand is how much demanded, so not just wanted, but able to be um acquired.
Okay, so what is the thing we're talking about?
Call it widget A.
Right. In order for it to first fall under the demand category, it has to be something that you consciously want. Right? That's the
Okay,
origin
so
of
let's say
all
I want
demand.
widget A and a bunch of other people want widget A. So there's
Yeah.
a level of demand for it.
Yes.
And let's say a bunch of people are able to and are producing widget A. So there's also a supply of it.
Hmm. And they produce widget A because they think people want it. That's the only reason they've done that, right?
So how does your definition of supply and demand
Um, I'm bringing it to the individual
apply?
level because all these things start as individual choices in an individual's brain, mind. I'm trying to get people to see
And
how it applies to everything you do, like every choice you make about how you spend your time as a consequence of your perception of supply and demand too. And then you just scale these things up to the macro level.
so interesting that you start with the micro for supply and demand. I wouldn't have thought about it in that way. What was your definition again on the micro level?
Demand is your perception of what you want. Supply is your perception of the options for acquiring what you perceive you want. So supply doesn't really have any meaning until you first define demand, right? Supply is dependent on demand, even though it's usually said the other way.
Interesting. I'm
Supply
not
and
sure
demand.
how that goes up to the macro, how it's understood at the macro level of supply
Well,
and
if you're
demand.
in business and you're trying to sell a product that no one wants, does it matter how much of it you have?
No,
Yeah. If I did a print run of 10,000 copies of my book, but I couldn't convince anyone except my mother to buy one, it doesn't really matter that I have those 10,000 copies. They're not
no,
being
that's the
used as
same point.
books, right? Even if I think it's the greatest fucking book in the world, even if it contains knowledge that is revolutionary and could change people's lives, right? Objectively, like the knowledge in it could change the world. If I cannot convince people to subjectively demand it, it doesn't matter. It will not be a functioning part of the economy. People will not be choosing to acquire it or consume it by reading it as a book.
How it follows from
It
your micro
it
version to
all
the
has to be
macro.
framed individual choices and subjective preferences, which is something that people who try to manage an economy don't understand. But we're talking about dictators before. A dictator is somebody who enforces their subjective preferences over other people on the scale of the Soviet Union or China or whatever, right? That's interventionism of any kind in a nutshell. someone in a position of social authority who can use force to apply their subjective preferences over the rest of the economy, saying people should want this. So I will force them to produce it, and I will force them to acquire and consume it. It is the
So
negation
trying
of
to
human
subvert the
volition.
law of supply and demand.
Yes, trying to pretend it doesn't exist.
Trying to do better than the natural and unassailable laws of economics.
Yes. I think the key to understanding this book, as I intended it, and economics in general, is asking a simple question like, at what point does supply and demand stop applying? Actually, it's funny because I thought of it as like how I finally understood the concept of biological evolution. At what point does natural selection stop applying? Like if you can understand natural selection on the micro level,
What do you mean by at what point?
like a lot of people
For
in the
supply and
world,
demand.
a lot of people in the world have a problem with the concept of speciation in biological evolution, that eventually, over a long enough period of time, one species can turn into more than one different species, right? Because they just don't see how a change that big could occur. But almost everyone can understand natural selection as it occurs on the micro level. Like if you have a population of birds that, feed better if they have beaks shaped a certain way, that over time that population of birds will breed more and more of that type of beak. That just seems obvious, right? Like how could you possibly deny that? Because it assists in their survival. So at what point does that principle stop applying? If you have a population subjected to particular conditions over many, 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 many generations, what's the limit to how much they can differentiate? And how did you decide that was the limit, right? So once you break that barrier in your mind, the scalability of the barrier, it becomes a lot easier to see the chain of causality between all things.
The
Large
what?
scale things.
Ality? The
The chain of
audio
causality,
chain of causality.
right? And so that's kind of how I think of an economy now too, like however big the economy is. If you can understand the individual choices that move an economy, the mechanics of an economy on an individual level, of somebody making choices to pursue their own satisfaction based upon what they perceive their options to be, at what point do those mechanics stop applying? If you have 100 people, if you have 1,000 people, if you have 100 billion people?
So I'm to infer then that your answer is they don't.
Why would they stop applying? At what point do they no there's no argument to say, well, here's the limit, right? But that's what the interventionists and the dictators would have you believe, that like, oh yeah, that all stuff all makes sense on the small scale, but if you're running a whole country, who would build the roads? Who would run the schools? Who would run the hospitals? Who, right? Like somebody has
Who will pick the cotton?
power making those choices and forcing them on everyone, otherwise they wouldn't happen, right?
Yeah, without slaves, who will pick the cotton?
Right. Which is also very bad reasoning I get very sick of. Well, this is the way we currently do things, therefore it's the only way they can work. Which is very anti-entrepreneurial, because again, entrepreneurship is about coming up with new ways of doing things to produce more of what you want for less of what you don't want.
Those people sound like the people who would like be there when the first human discovers fire and then they're scared of it and kill him.
Yeah. Again, that's the Armenian mentality in a nutshell. Like, I don't like the way you're doing that. It scares me. It looks dangerous. It's different than the way we're used to doing things. Therefore, I default to resisting this scary new thing because I can't envision the benefits it will bring me. I only envision the danger, the risk. Right. So the whole point of the book, again, it's primarily about Armenians because that's where I have the most direct experience, but you could apply these same principles to almost anywhere in the world, particularly in developing countries, but even in the West, there's a lot of this. I think a lot of Americans who read this have been surprised by, like, yeah, I thought I understood this stuff, but the more I think about it and like how it really applies to everything we do and everything going on in our economy, that was my goal. To make people see this is an absolute total concept that applies to everything you and your neighbors and everyone does. And for the Armenians who read it, it has been translated into Armenian, which I insisted on, primarily because I wanted the locals I wrote about to be able to read in their own language. Most of them don't speak English, of course.
You have another book addressing that, the speaking English,
Oh, yeah, our global lingua franca, why
covering all
everyone's
your
about
grounds
English.
there.
Yeah. Everything I write is connected in some way, right? I wanted them to see and understand like how their society looks to the Western entrepreneurial outsider mentality, right? And I've gotten some very good feedback from some people who have read it. Some prominent businessmen in Yerevan have read it. They were very impressed. They compared it to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. Like the way you describe the way we think about money
Nice.
and the way we teach our kids to think about these things is so accurate. And like they're kind of embarrassed. Like the ones who get it, they say yeah, it's so primitive that we still do these things. Like we should know better by now. It's the 21st century, you know?
Do you
Um,
expect people reading this book to be able to use what you put forth to them to lift themselves up to become stronger entrepreneurially, to have less fear holding them back from self-determining their own lives economically?
I hope to God that it has that kind of effect on someone who reads it, because of course it's very different to just read something and understand it like intellectually. Like if you're an intelligent person and you read this, I don't know how you could disagree with the things I'm saying, the arguments I'm making. But just understanding them is not enough. You still need that emotional confidence to start living your life differently, which is a lot easier to do if people are younger when they first get exposed to these kinds of ideas. I'll give you an example. I mentioned about the disputed territory Artsakh recently being taken over. So about 100,000 Artsakis were forced to be displaced back into the rest of Armenia when this
Do you
happened.
say 100,000?
Yeah, about 100,000 people
That's quite a
suddenly.
sizable number.
Yeah. And some of them came to my village, Calavan. Two families, I think, came from Artsakh and to occupy some of the houses in the village here. And one of them was a 17-year-old girl who barely spoke any English, but we started talking. I gave her some English lessons. I gave her some music lessons. She seemed pretty bright, especially compared to the rest of her family. And I had recently gotten the Armenian translation of Everyone is an Entrepreneur done, Amen Vok Zeneretse. And I gave her a copy just saying like, oh, I'm an author.
Don't ask me to pronounce that.
I won't. I gave her a copy, just like not really expecting her to read it necessarily or saying, oh, you have to read this book, but just saying, I'm an author. Here's a copy of my book. It just got translated into Armenian. She read the whole fucking book in 3 days. I was
That's
surprised when she told
dedication.
me. And I thought maybe she was exaggerating. I said, like, did you really understand it? Like, are you sure you actually got the whole thing? Like, what did you learn from it? And she gave some pretty impressive answers. She says, like, yeah, you're talking about how the way our parents think about money. She said that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our parents think about money and business and how we work and all these things, and we need to start thinking differently than them. And like she seemed to actually
So she learned one of
understand.
your big lessons then
Yeah.
from in the
So
book.
now I can only hope that because she's so young and pretty bright, that this could have had a major developmental effect on her paradigm of entrepreneurship, economics, business, and money. And maybe in some way she will make different choices throughout her life because she learned these things. And frankly, in a situation where she probably would not have had many other opportunities to learn these things, because there are just not very many people here talking about these things, and certainly not directly in the Armenian language. Anyway, so, as an artist, as an education entrepreneur, that's the most rewarding thing for me when I see that somebody actually read my book and it seemed to actually affect the way they think about the thing I wrote about.
So you can ask for, really.
You can ask for money.
Yeah. Asking for money doesn't sound very entrepreneurial. That sounds like just hoping someone else can change your life for you.
Well, no, I mean it in the sense that I produced something that I am confident is uniquely valuable for a certain type of person. So give me $10 or $20 for this book that might change your fucking life.
Oh yeah, in
Hell of a bargain.
exchange for, not just
Yeah.
asking
No,
for
no, no.
money.
Please give me money. No.
Yeah,
Well, no, it's
that's what
that
it sounded like.
with that girl, I gave her a copy for free. But in general, if I told you I've written this book that could potentially change the way you think about a very important subject and be very, very useful throughout the rest of your life, is that not worth $10 or $20 plus the time it takes you to read the book?
And they might be like, well, 10, yeah, but 20, I don't know, because I haven't read the book to know if it's worth that.
Yeah, well, that's sales, which is the final part of the book where I talk about entrepreneurship applied in reality, which is where I take those basic concepts like scarcity and supply and demand and speculation and division of labor. And I say, well, here's how you actually use these things through things like sales and marketing and pricing various things and building a brand identity and developing a unique selling proposition. So it all is integrated. I start from the very, very
Speaking of a
foundation.
brand identity, to what extent would you say this book is paired with your previous book, Brand Identity Breakthrough? Are they a
Uh,
set? Are they
Funny thing about
completely
that,
distinct?
the first book I wrote was Brand Identity Breakthrough, which was just a guide to like how you communicate an identity in a business context, right? And it in many ways that's the tamest, mildest book I'll ever write because it was kind of just experimenting with what I can put into a book that people will buy, and that was what I had the most professional experience with at the time. And it sold a lot. It sold over 15,000 copies at this point, which is kind of like miraculous for a self-published book. Like it's nothing compared to major publishers, but that's far, far more than most self-published books ever sell. And it got pretty good reviews. But the number one criticism it got from even people who liked the book was like, yeah, it's really interesting, but it's too like theoretical. Like it needed more
I
practical
was thinking that would
tips, like
be,
do this with your business or
yeah,
your product, instead of like, well,
people
here's
want to
how
be
business
spoon-fed a
works.
bit more
Right.
in
And
general.
and so now this is the second business book I've written. This is 100 times as theoretical and like cerebral and and the
That's
last
what you want to do. You don't want to be bogged down in the
yes,
concrete details, spoon-feeding people, do you?
I didn't plan this, but this book ends where Brand Identity Breakthrough began. This is like a
Ah,
prequel to that in a sense.
prequel,
The last
theoretical
chapter,
prequel.
chapter 21, Brand Identity, upholding the symbol of a promise or ideal. That's like everything else is building up to that point. Now that you understand all these fundamental economic concepts and have seen the examples of how it applies to this developing post-Soviet nation, here's the result. You present yourself as a certain identity representing a certain type of unique value in a compelling way on the market, and people want to partake in the value that you represent, the principles that you represent. And then, of course, if you want, you can go read Brand Identity Breakthrough to have a longer conversation about that particular thing.
Do you think this book helps people with brand identity breakthrough? So the complaints you received about brand identity breakthrough, do you think this will help people reading this first and then go to brand identity breakthrough will help with that?
Uh, I think you should only read this book if you really want to understand economics, not just in like the practical, fun, interesting top 10 tips to sell more in your business. It's not at all that kind of book. And it's not even like a travel book. Like maybe some people think that it's like about my life in Armenia. Isn't this interesting? That's part of it. That's maybe
How
like
could they think
20%
that
of
from the
it.
title?
Yeah, I don't know. People don't read descriptions or titles sometimes. Um, I've had people complain about some of the strangest things in my books. Like, why did you think that's what the book was going to be about? Did I not make it clear? So
And they were
it's
like, I was on multiple drugs at that time.
maybe.
Only explanation.
Um, I would say fundamentally, if you want to understand how basic and easy and universally applicable the field of economics is, this is better than probably any university course you could take on the subject. And because it's framed in that human way of like, here's actual applications in the lives of Armenians because they live in a post-communist country, they never learned how to think this way or do things this way. And you can see the obvious effects of how it is slowing their development and harming them materially and philosophically and volitionally, that to me really like makes it obvious, like something you take for granted is just being known. Everyone knows that, right? Okay, but what would a society where people didn't know that look like? Can you see how inhibited they would be? That's the purpose of this book. I don't think I will ever write a top 10 tips to do more whatever type of book, because that's just not the
Not
type of
top
writer I
10
am.
tips, but
I will almost certainly write another business book at some point in my writing career, just because I'm very passionate about business. But I already know it would have to be a really unique angle on something, like what I did with Everyone is an Entrepreneur. I didn't just want to write another business book. I wanted to write a business book no one had ever written before, right? No one else but me could have written this book because of the unique experiences I've had, the unique way I have of thinking about these things and bringing all that information together. Lots of people have written great books about brand identity development and sales, right? But I don't know who else could write a book like this, right? So whatever business book I write next would have to be similar in that regard, where it'd have to be something really original that no one else would think to write or could write, but could totally change the way you think about something.
otherwise it's not worth your time to write, because
exactly. It's not
someone
worth my
else will
time
write
to
at
write.
some point.
And it's not worth most people's time to read, you know?
It might be just they can read it from someone else writing it.
Right. So there'd be no reason for them to read mine, which is a basic economic concept. If I'm not offering something of unique value, there's no reason for you to choose mine versus someone else's.
I mean, let's be honest, yours would probably be better.
Right, but I'd have to at least then frame it that way, which is true with even Brand Identity Breakthrough, which, like I said, is probably the most normal, tamest book I'll ever write. I still do go deeper into some of these well-known sales and marketing and branding concepts than most authors do, right? I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm just explaining things more in-depthly and in a more organized way, just because that's how I think. That's one of my strengths as a writer.
Re-explaining the wheel.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about the wheel this way? You know?
You're looking at the wheel all wrong.
Yeah. That's so, yeah, in a sense, certainly every book I ever write will be doing that. But also there are books like this that, just because of the experiences I'm talking about and how they formed concepts for me and demonstrate principles, who else but someone who has lived a similar life to me could have even attempted to write a book?